She stood barefoot outside the supermarket, the cracked pavement cold against her skin. In her arms, a baby wailed, a thin, piercing sound that cut through the evening air. 4 other children, little more than ghosts in oversized clothes, clung to her skirt. Their eyes were huge, their faces smudged with dirt, and a silence that was far more terrifying than any scream. She leaned toward a man leaving the store, a man whose face was so etched with grief that people in the town of Grace Lake would cross the street just to avoid the sadness he carried. And she whispered it, the words catching in her throat like dust. "I haven't eaten in 2 days. They've had nothing but water." The man stopped. He looked at her, at the 5 small faces staring up at him, and slowly, his hand trembled as it reached into his worn coat pocket. It wasn't the cold that made him shake. It was the storm that had been raging inside him for months. A storm that had started the day he buried his wife, and had only grown stronger when he lost his job 2 weeks later. Until this very second, he believed he was the most broken man in the world. He thought no one on earth could possibly be worse off than him. But standing there, under the flickering neon sign of a corner store, he was about to learn how wrong he was. Because what he was about to uncover wasn't just a story of hunger. It was a story of secrets, of lies, of a darkness that was wrapped so tightly around this small town that it was about to suffocate them all. And the truth he would find would not only haunt him and heal him, but it would lead him to a single, terrifying choice that would change everything. But before we dive into that, I want you to do something for me. Take a second and hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications, because you are not going to want to miss a single second of where this story is going. Trust me. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Before the hunger, before the grief, before 2 shattered worlds collided on a cold Tuesday afternoon and lit a fuse that would burn this town to the ground. Dust was the unofficial 6th resident of every home in Grace Lake. It settled on the windowsills, coated the tired porch swings, and filled the cracks in the sidewalks that spiderwebbed through the town, cracks born from summers that were too hot and winters that were too stubborn to let go. This wasn't a town you visited for a vacation. You were either born in Grace Lake, or you ended up there after you'd lost something important. Your job, your hope, your way. For Maria, it was both. She'd arrived 5 years ago, dragging a single suitcase with a busted wheel. A baby was strapped to her chest, a threadbare blanket wrapped around him. There was no husband beside her, no family to greet her, just that broken suitcase, that tiny baby, and a weariness in her eyes that seemed so deep, no amount of sleep could ever fix it. The people of Grace Lake noticed her immediately. How could they not? A young woman, impossibly thin, with 5 children trailing behind her like a line of little ducklings. Each one looked to be spaced about a year apart. The math alone was enough to get the tongues wagging. The children were what unsettled people the most. They never smiled. They never cried or threw tantrums in the grocery aisle. They just stared at the ground, their shoulders hunched, following their mother in a silent, watchful procession that made your skin crawl. It didn't take long for the rumors to start, whispered over coffee at the diner and across fences in the evening. Did you see the scar on her neck? Looks like a knife wound. I heard she's on the run, from a man, or maybe the law. She doesn't say much. You think she's slow in the head? Look at the way she walks with that limp. Something's wrong with her. She's sick. It wasn't sickness. Not the kind they were thinking of. The limp was a ghost, a permanent echo of a car crash that had happened a lifetime ago. Before the children, before Grace Lake, before she finally stopped believing that anyone would ever come to rescue her. Her voice was soft, not because she was shy, but because she was tired. So deeply tired of explaining herself, of justifying her own existence. The scar on her neck? She never, ever talked about it. Not even to Mia, her oldest. The silence wasn't just a habit, it was a fortress. It was the kind of silence that builds up around you when you realize no one uses your name anymore. When the only human contact you have is the brief brush of fingers as you exchange a few crumpled dollars at the store, or the pitying smile from the librarian who sees you huddled in the corner with your kids more often than she sees her own family. They didn't call her Maria. They never called her Maria. They called her that woman with the kids. None of the children were in school. The town had theories about that too. Some said she was too lazy to do the paperwork. Others whispered that the system had failed them, shaking their heads with a kind of smug satisfaction. The truth was simpler and much, much sadder. She couldn't afford the school supplies. She couldn't afford the doctor's checkups required for enrollment. But mostly, she was terrified. Terrified that if someone in a position of authority looked too closely at her children, at their patched clothes, their gaunt faces, they would take them away. That was a fear that lived in her bones. Their small rental house was crumbling around them. 2 tiny bedrooms for 6 human beings. The water heater was broken, so she washed their clothes in a big plastic tub in the backyard, using water she heated on the stove. She'd hang them on a line that sagged in the middle, just like her shoulders did when she thought no one was watching. Her children learned things that no child should ever have to learn. They learned how to make a single can of beans feel like a feast. They learned how to read books by flashlight when the power was cut off. They learned how to hold their breath and be perfectly still whenever the landlord came banging on the door. There were days Maria didn't eat at all. She would tell the kids she'd already eaten or that she wasn't hungry, just so they wouldn't feel guilty as they scraped their own plates clean. Some days, the sadness was a physical weight, too heavy to carry. It would pin her to the bed, paralyzing her, stealing her breath. On those days, her oldest daughter, 9-year-old Mia, would become the mother. She would quietly get out of bed, toast the last 2 slices of bread, tie her little brother's shoes, and gently wipe the baby's face with a damp cloth. Maria's world wasn't just poor. It was invisible. She had become part of the town's dreary landscape, like the cracked fountain in the park that never worked, or the rusted swing set that groaned in the wind. People would see her walking down the street, and their eyes would just slide right past her. And maybe that was what hurt the most, not the gnawing hunger in her belly, or the judgmental stares, or even the memories that clawed at her in the dead of night. It was the invisibility, the fact that nobody saw her. They saw a problem, a burden, a cautionary tale they'd tell their own children. See what happens when you make bad choices? They didn't see the woman who once laughed so hard that her ribs ached. They didn't see the woman who used to hum lullabies to her firstborn, even when her own stomach was growling louder than the baby's cries. They didn't see the way she tucked each child into bed every single night with a whispered prayer, or how she sat on the floor after they were asleep, painstakingly taping together the torn pages of old workbooks she'd found in the trash, trying to teach them anything that might give them a chance at a life better than hers. They had no idea that she still remembered the exact smell of her husband's worn flannel shirt, a mix of sawdust and soap, even though he had been gone for 5 long years. He was killed in a robbery gone wrong, she'd told the few people who'd asked. Daddy's with the stars now, she told the kids, and she prayed they would believe it, just for a little while longer. But that's not the whole story. It's not even close, because sometimes, when the silence in the house grew so loud it felt like screaming, she would go out into the backyard, bury her face in a dirty pillow, and scream until her throat was raw and no sound came out at all. No one in Grace Lake saw any of that. No one bothered to look, no one ever asked. Until one day, someone did. But we're not there yet. There was one place in town where Maria felt a sliver of peace, a place where the judgment seemed to fade. It wasn't a church. It wasn't a shelter. It was the back alley behind Rizzo's market. That's where they threw out the produce that was too bruised or too soft to sell on the shelves. Maria had learned the schedule by heart, Mondays and Thursdays, right at 6 p.m. She would slip into the alley like a shadow and scavenge for anything she could find. Apples with brown spots, bananas that were already turning black. Sometimes, if she was really lucky, she'd find a sealed loaf of bread that was just a day past its sell-by date. She taught her children how to be invisible, how to look without touching too much, how to move quickly and quietly, and how to smile, a wide, innocent smile, if a store employee happened to catch them, as if they were just playing a game in the alley. That's where she was on the day everything changed. She was standing behind Rizzo's, clutching a tomato that was so soft it was almost liquid. In that moment, it felt like a treasure. But then the baby, restless and hungry, started to cry again. A weak, miserable wail that tore right through her. Her arms were too tired to bounce him. Her knees ached too much to crouch down and soothe him. And for the first time in a long, long time, she felt a different kind of desperation. Not the quiet, constant ache she carried with her every day. This was a new kind. It was loud. It was ugly. It was a shaking hands, heart-pounding panic that screamed at her to do something. So she did. She did something she had sworn to herself she would never do. She gathered her children, took a deep breath that felt like swallowing glass, and walked around to the front of the market. She didn't have a plan. She just stood there on the sidewalk, not begging, not at first, just standing, a silent statue of despair, until one of her little boys, the 4-year-old, tugged on her skirt and whispered, his voice barely audible, "Mama, I'm hungry." And that's when she broke. She looked up and saw a man walking out of the store, a man with a coat that was too big for his frame and eyes that looked as sad as her own. She locked eyes with this total stranger, and the words just fell out of her mouth. "Sir, do you have any food you could spare?" What Maria didn't know was that this man, Samuel, had just walked away from everything that had ever mattered to him. His home, his church, the grave he visited every single morning. And what Samuel didn't know was that this wasn't just a simple moment of charity. This was a spark that was about to ignite a fire. And neither of them could have possibly imagined who would get burned. The wind picked up right as she spoke, a chilly gust that lifted the stray ends of her dark hair and seemed to carry her whispered plea directly to him. "Sir, do you have any food you could spare?" He stopped, not because he wanted to. His first instinct was to keep walking, to retreat back into the gray fog of his own grief. But there was something in her voice, something so fragile, so desperate, so completely shattered, that it snagged on him like a fishhook. He forced himself to look at her. Really look. Not at her stained clothes, or the wailing baby, or the way her other children were hiding behind her legs. He looked at her face, and for the first time in months, he felt the air get punched out of his lungs. Grief knows its own. It recognizes the hollowed-out look in another person's eyes, even when that person is a stranger dressed in rags. He was a tall man, maybe in his late 40s. Not old, but not young either. He looked like life had worn him down, sanding away all his sharp edges. His coat hung loosely on his shoulders, the sleeves dangling past his wrists, as if he'd lost a great deal of weight recently. His eyes were bloodshot and exhausted. In his right hand he clutched a single plastic grocery bag. It wasn't much. A loaf of bread, a can of chicken noodle soup, a sleeve of saltine crackers, and a single chocolate bar he'd grabbed at the checkout counter without even thinking about it. He looked down at the food in his hand, then back up at her. All the children were staring at the ground, except for the oldest girl, Mia. She was staring right at him, her gaze sharp and filled with a practiced suspicion that was unsettling in a child so young. She didn't trust strangers. Her mother had taught her that lesson well. "I can share," Samuel said. His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it much lately. He held out the bag. Maria hesitated. For a split second, her pride, the last thing she had left, warred with the gnawing hunger in her stomach. But then the baby let out another cry, a sound that decided the battle for her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. She didn't take the whole bag. She reached in and took only the loaf of bread. She immediately tore off a piece and handed it to her youngest son, then another piece to the toddler beside him. She looked up at Samuel again, a silent dismissal in her eyes, as if to say, "You can go now. You've done your good deed." But he didn't go. Instead, he did something that made her freeze. He knelt down slowly, his knees cracking as they met the cold sidewalk, and he gently placed the rest of the groceries on the ground beside her. The can of soup, the crackers, the chocolate bar. "Name's Samuel," he said after a moment of silence. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. "Maria," she finally replied. They didn't shake hands. There was no formal introduction. But something in the air shifted. A silent acknowledgement passed between them, a wordless understanding that they were both members of the same lonely club. Maria didn't invite him to stay, but Samuel didn't leave. He just sat down on the curb a few feet away from her, not so close that it felt threatening, but close enough that his presence felt like a quiet statement. The baby, his tiny belly now full of bread, finally stopped crying and drifted off to sleep in Maria's arms. The silence stretched on, filled only by the sound of the wind. "I lost my wife," Samuel said suddenly, his voice low. Maria didn't respond, but her head tilted just slightly in his direction. 3 months ago," he continued, staring at a crack in the pavement. "Cancer. It was fast, aggressive." He paused, swallowing hard. "She used to feed the stray cats behind our apartment building. Said every hungry mouth deserved a chance, no matter how it got there." Maria watched her children ravenously eating the bread, their faces serious with concentration. "I used to give food to the shelter," she said softly. "Before all this." He nodded. "Funny how the world can just flip upside down, isn't it?" Another silence fell between them, longer this time. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of quiet that happens when two people are so broken that words feel unnecessary. Their souls were communicating in a language of shared pain. Across the street, a curtain in a second-story window twitched. Old Miss Tillman, a woman whose main currency was gossip, was watching. She was always watching. She'd already told half the town that she was sure Maria was a thief. Probably a drug addict, too, she'd said to anyone who would listen. No decent woman ends up with 5 kids and no husband unless there's something shady going on. Samuel saw the curtain move. He could feel the town's collective gaze shifting onto him, just as it had ever since his wife, Evelyn, had passed. They didn't understand him. They didn't understand why he'd stopped going to church, why he'd quit his job at the auto shop he'd owned for 20 years, why he now spent his days walking aimlessly through the streets, talking to no one, carrying groceries he rarely even ate. They didn't know that he had tried to end his own life. Twice. The only thing that had stopped him the second time was a photograph he kept in his wallet. It was a picture of Evelyn holding their stillborn daughter, Lily. In the photo, Evelyn was smiling, but there were tears streaming down her face. He saw that same smile on Maria's face right now as she gently wiped a crumb from her toddler's cheek. It was a smile that was broken and brave, and so terrifyingly human it stole his breath away. "People here. They talk," Maria said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "You should go, before they start talking about you, too." "Let them," he said with a shrug that didn't quite look convincing. She turned her head and looked at him then. Not a glance. A full, direct look. Her eyes were dark and deep, and for a second, he felt like she could see every single one of his scars. "You don't scare easy," she observed. "I've already been through the worst thing that could ever happen to me," he said, his voice hollow. "After that, what's left to be afraid of?" A tiny, sad smile touched the corner of her mouth. It was a fleeting expression, there and gone in a heartbeat. "You don't know what worse is yet," she said softly. He didn't argue with her. He knew she was right. Instead, he reached back into his coat pocket and pulled out the single chocolate bar. "Don't let the kids see you eat this," he whispered, handing it to her like they were co-conspirators sharing a secret. "This one's for you." She took it from him without a word of thanks. She didn't need to say anything. The look in her eyes was enough. They sat there a little longer as the sun began to sink below the rooftops, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The long shadows of the buildings stretched across the sidewalk, reaching for them. Eventually, Samuel pushed himself to his feet. "Do you come here often?" he asked, the question sounding clumsy and awkward. She nodded once, her eyes on her children. "Mondays, Thursdays, after 6. He nodded too. "Maybe I'll see you again." And then he just walked away. He didn't ask for her number. He didn't ask where she lived. He didn't linger. He just vanished around the corner, disappearing as quietly as he had appeared. But as Maria watched him go, she felt something shift in her chest. A tiny flicker, like a pilot light that had been extinguished for years, suddenly trying to reignite. It was hope. Hope was a dangerous thing. She knew that better than anyone. She had buried hope a long time ago, right alongside the man who went to work one day and never came home. But here it was, a tiny, fragile spark, and it was real. She looked down at her children. They were licking the last of the breadcrumbs from their fingers. For the first time in a long time, they looked like children, not like tiny, sad ghosts. Maybe this was the start of something. Or maybe it was just a fluke, a single moment of kindness in a world that had shown her none. Either way, she wouldn't forget his name. Samuel. Across town, the rumors were already slithering through the phone lines before the sun had even fully set. "Did you hear? Samuel Lowe was sitting on the sidewalk with her, talking to her like she was a normal person, didn't even look ashamed. He must be sleeping with her. It's disgusting. 5 kids, can you imagine?" But a few people, the quieter ones, noticed something else. They noticed that Samuel was walking a little straighter that night. They noticed he didn't make his usual grim pilgrimage past the cemetery, and he didn't stop at the liquor store on the corner. Instead, he went straight home. He opened the can of chicken noodle soup he had meant to give to Maria, heated it on the stove, and sat down at his empty kitchen table. And for the first time in 3 months, he ate. He was still alone. But for the first time in a very long time, he didn't feel hollow. And that's when he started to wonder about the woman on the sidewalk, not just her hunger, but the look in her eyes, that flicker of a smile. You don't know what worse is yet. What did she mean by that? What could possibly be worse than the hell he was living in? He had no idea that he was about to find out. And the truth was far more twisted than he could ever imagine. It wasn't the limp. It wasn't her haunted silence. It wasn't even the fact that she scavenged for food in the alley behind Rizzo's market. No, what finally gave the town of Grace Lake the excuse it had been waiting for was a coat. A simple, second-hand child's coat. It was for Mia. It was a dark blue parka, a little too large for her thin frame, with a hood trimmed in faux fur. It had patches on both elbows, clearly well-loved, and mended with care. But it was warm, and with winter breathing down their necks, it was a godsend. That coat is what set the fire. The whispers started at the post office. Where'd a woman like that get a nice coat for her kid? The question evolved at the diner. That looks exactly like one of the coats that was donated to the church's winter drive. By the time the story reached Miss Tillman's ears, it had become a full-blown accusation. That bin of coats from the church, wasn't it stolen last week? Right off the church steps? I bet she took it. The story spread like a disease, quietly at first, then infecting everyone. By Friday morning, it was accepted as fact. People who used to offer Maria a tight, pitying smile now crossed the street to avoid her. The librarian, who had once let the kids stay past closing time to finish their books, suddenly locked the doors a full hour early when she saw Maria and her children approaching. The owner of the diner, who used to slip her a bag of leftover toast at the end of the day, now just turned his back and pretended not to see her standing outside his window. And then came the knock on the door, the one she had been dreading every single day for 5 years. A police officer stood on her sagging porch, his expression a mixture of boredom and distaste. He wasn't alone. Standing just behind him, looking deeply uncomfortable, was a woman from Child Protective Services. Someone had filed a formal report. The words echoed in the small, stuffy room as the officer read them from his notepad. Theft of donated goods, chronic neglect, vagrancy. They didn't arrest her. Not that night. But the message was delivered with chilling clarity. They were building a case. One more misstep, one more complaint, one more anything, and her children would be taken. They'll be placed in foster care, the officer said, his tone flat and devoid of any emotion. Given a chance at a real home. He said it without a trace of irony. Maria stood in the doorway long after they drove away, the cold air seeping into the house. Her children were huddled together on the couch behind her, their silence a heavy blanket in the room. Her chest ached with a pain that was sharper than hunger. It was shame, a deep, burning shame that was so potent it made her feel sick. It wasn't true. None of it. She hadn't stolen anything. She had found the coat, along with a few other outgrown sweaters, in a cardboard box set next to the community dumpster behind the library. It was clearly marked, free. But she knew the truth didn't matter now. The town had already held its trial and delivered its verdict. She was guilty. And that night, everything fell apart. The baby woke up crying, his hunger sharp and demanding. She went to the kitchen to make him a bottle, her hands shaking. She opened the canister of formula. It was empty. She frantically searched the pantry, her heart pounding against her ribs. There was nothing. Nothing but a handful of stale crackers and a jar of peanut butter, with maybe 1 spoonful left in the bottom. In that moment, something inside Maria finally shattered. It wasn't a loud, dramatic break. There were no screams, no shattered plates. It was a quiet, terrifying implosion. She simply picked up the crying baby, wrapped him tightly in a thin scarf, and walked out of the house. She didn't say a word to Mia. She didn't pack a bag. She didn't even stop to put on proper shoes. Her bare feet slapped against the cold, damp pavement as she walked. She walked past the corner store, its windows dark. She walked past the church, its steeple a black silhouette against the bruised purple sky. She walked past the old oak tree at the edge of town, the one that always lost its leaves before all the others. A light snow had begun to fall. Tiny, delicate flakes that didn't seem like much at first, but were already beginning to stick to the ground, blanketing the world in a ghostly white. She didn't feel the cold. The ache inside her was so profound, so all-consuming, that it had numbed her to everything else long ago. She didn't stop walking until she reached the edge of Grace Lake, where the rusty train tracks curved away into the dark woods and disappeared. Her legs were shaking uncontrollably now. She sank down into the tall, frozen grass by the side of the tracks, holding the baby so tightly against her chest that he whimpered once. Then he went quiet, and that silence, that sudden stillness, scared her more than his crying ever had. This was it, she thought, the end of the line. Maybe this was the world's answer to the question she had been screaming into her pillow for years. Am I too broken to be fixed? The answer, it seemed, was yes. She closed her eyes, the snowflakes melting on her lashes like tears. The wind howled a long, mournful sound through the trees, and then everything went still. Samuel didn't find the note until almost 3 hours later. He had decided to walk by Maria's rental house. He didn't know why. He just had a feeling, a cold knot of dread in the pit of his stomach that he couldn't ignore. The note was tucked under a rock on the porch of the house next door. It was scribbled in pencil on a torn piece of a cereal box. The handwriting was shaky, almost illegible. "I'm sorry, I can't let them take my kids. I just needed some air. Please tell them I love them." The neighbor, a kind elderly woman who had once given Maria a bag of apples from her tree, had already called the police. The police had called the local shelter, and someone at the shelter, for a reason no one could later explain, had called Samuel. Maybe someone had seen them talking that day outside the market. Maybe the universe just knew. Within minutes, Samuel was out the door. He didn't get in his car. He didn't call anyone for help. He just started walking. He knew where she would be. Not the exact spot, but he knew the direction. Grief leaves a trail. Despair leaves a trail. And he had learned how to follow those trails a long time ago. He had followed one just like it to find his wife's favorite scarf tangled in the reeds at the edge of the lake, the week after she died. He followed Maria's footprints in the freshly fallen snow. They were faint, but they were there. The small prints of her bare feet, a slight dragging step from her limp. He saw the place where she had stopped and leaned against a tree for support. He found her just as the first hint of dawn was breaking the horizon. She was sitting under the hulking iron skeleton of a railroad bridge. The baby was asleep on her chest, his little face peaceful. Her head was slumped forward, her dark hair covering her face. She looked like a statue carved from sorrow. He didn't call out to her. He didn't want to startle her. He just walked over and sat down in the snow beside her. He didn't say a word. He just waited. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an hour. The only sound was the whisper of the wind. Then, without turning to look at him, she spoke. Her voice was a raw, broken whisper. "I didn't want to die." "I know," he said softly. I just didn't want to feel this way anymore." He nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I've felt that way too." The baby stirred in her arms, and she gently adjusted his blanket, her movements slow and stiff. She still didn't look at Samuel. "I didn't steal that coat," she whispered. "I believe you. They're going to take my babies, Samuel." "No," he said, his voice firm. "No, they're not." "How do you know that?" she asked, a bitter edge to her voice. "Because," he said, his voice dropping, filled with a conviction that surprised even himself. "I won't let them." She finally turned her head then and looked at him. Her eyes were hollowed-out pits of exhaustion and despair, rimmed with red. But there was no surprise in them. It was as if she had been expecting him. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I'm not here because I owe you something," he replied, his gaze steady. "I'm here because I see you, Maria. I really see you." Those words did something to her. They were like a key turning a lock that had been rusted shut for years. A tiny crack appeared in the fortress she had built around her heart. It wasn't enough to let the tears out, not yet, but it was enough for her shoulders to slump, to release a fraction of the tension she had been holding for so long. Samuel took off his own heavy coat and gently draped it over her legs. She didn't resist. He then pulled a thermos from the inside pocket of his jacket and handed it to her. "Tea," he said. "It's still warm." She took it, her fingers brushing against his. "You think this fixes anything?" she asked quietly. "No," he said, "but it's a start." They sat there together in silence as the sky slowly transformed from black to a bruised purple, and then to a pale, fragile gray. The morning light crept over the landscape, revealing the harsh truths of the world. The tear in the sleeve of Maria's thin sweater, the frost clinging to the hem of her jeans, the deep, dark lines of exhaustion that were carved into her face. But the light also revealed something else. It revealed a man, kneeling in the snow beside a woman, not to rescue her, not to be her hero, but simply to sit with her in the darkness and to remind her that she wasn't alone. When they finally stood up, Maria's legs were so weak they wobbled beneath her. Samuel instinctively offered her his arm. She didn't take it, but she walked beside him, step for step, all the way back to her house. That was enough. As they approached the dilapidated rental, the front door flew open. Mia stood there, her small face a mess of tears and relief and 1,000 unspoken questions. The second she saw her mother, her face crumpled completely. Maria knelt down on the snowy ground and pulled her oldest daughter into a fierce hug that seemed to last for a full minute. Then, she stood up and looked at all 5 of her children, who were now crowded in the doorway, their eyes wide and scared, and she said 3 words they hadn't heard her say in weeks. 3 words that felt like a promise. I'm still here. Samuel didn't move in. He didn't try to take over or play the hero. He understood that this wasn't his story to rewrite. His role was simpler and far more important. He just showed up. The next morning, he arrived with 3 full bags of groceries. The day after that, he brought boxes of hand-me-down clothes he'd gotten from a friend. The next week, he came with a piece of paper. On it was a name and a phone number for a lawyer at a legal aid society, a woman who specialized in protecting families exactly like hers from the system. And slowly, painstakingly, piece by piece, Maria's world began to rebuild itself. Not because a man had swooped in to save her, but because for the first time in a very long time, someone had chosen to stand beside her and stay. But the darkness in Grace Lake had deep roots, and it wasn't done with them yet. Samuel had a secret of his own, a secret much darker than Maria's, and it was about to crawl out of the past and threaten to destroy the fragile new beginning they were trying to build. Winter didn't just end in Grace Lake. It cracked. It broke apart not like a fragile branch, but like a massive dam giving way. One day there was snow and ice, and the next there was damp earth and the stubborn green shoots of crocuses pushing their way toward the sun. As the town shed its cold, gray skin, its interest in Maria began to fade. That was the nature of small-town gossip. It burned white-hot and fast, consuming everything in its path, and then it simply forgot what it had been so angry about in the first place. But Maria didn't forget. She couldn't. The fear and the shame had left their mark. She still walked with a quiet tension in her shoulders, still flinched if a stranger's voice got too loud near her children. But something else was there too, an undercurrent of strength that hadn't existed before. It was a new kind of stillness, a steadiness that came from knowing she wasn't weathering the storm alone anymore. Samuel saw it. He never mentioned it, never said things like, "You seem so much better," or "You look stronger." He knew that words like that could feel like a dismissal of the pain that was still there. Instead, he showed her. He showed up one morning with a truckload of firewood and stacked it neatly by her back door, without being asked. He quietly fixed the broken hinge on the kitchen cabinet that had been driving her crazy for months. He started teaching Mia how to check the oil in the beat-up old pickup truck he'd borrowed from a friend, a truck that was now essentially theirs. Together, they started to build, not just a defense against the town, but a life. It started with a piece of land. It was an old, forgotten property on the far edge of town. It had once been a horse ranch, but it had sat abandoned for years, ever since the Johnson family had packed up and moved away. The place was a wreck. The big red barn was sagging in the middle, its roof looking like a tired old spine. The fences were leaning at crazy angles, and the farmhouse itself looked like it was holding its breath, unsure if it was even allowed to be standing anymore. But Maria saw it, and something lit up in her eyes. "That," she said, pointing. "That could be something." Samuel looked from the dilapidated house to her face, one eyebrow raised in skepticism. "You really think so? It looks like one good wind could knock it all down." She nodded, a determined set to her jaw. It just needs work. Hands and time. And a whole lot of stubbornness, he added, a small smile playing on his lips. She returned the smile. It was a real one this time. A smile that reached her eyes, showing her teeth. Good thing we've got plenty of that. So they got to work. Samuel borrowed a chainsaw and started clearing the overgrown brush. Maria brought a rake and 5 little helpers who thought a giant pile of rotten fence posts was the best playground they had ever seen. They worked from sunup to sundown, day after day. They swept out the cobwebs, they sorted piles of junk, they salvaged any piece of wood that was still solid. The place began to change. Not quickly, not dramatically. It was a slow transformation, like watching a wound heal over time. By the end of April, they had made one room in the farmhouse livable. They had reinforced one stall in the barn, making it safe and dry. And they had put up a new mailbox at the end of the long dirt driveway. Samuel had stenciled their names on the side, painting them carefully in black letters, Rivera and Lowe. They weren't husband and wife. They weren't even officially partners. Their relationship was something quieter, something that existed in the space between words. But seeing their names there, side by side, it meant something, especially to the children. Mia started writing Mia Rivera Lowe on her school notebooks. The twin boys stopped asking what was for dinner every night. They just trusted that dinner would appear. Samuel started staying later and later each evening. Sometimes they would all eat together around the rickety old table they'd found in the barn. Other times, he would just sit by the fire pit they'd built outside, listening to the happy chaos of the children playing inside, a soft, peaceful smile on his face. Maria never asked him to move in, and he never pushed. They had both learned the hard way what it felt like to have your world ripped away from you in an instant. So they took their time, building their new life on a foundation of patience and quiet understanding. Then the letter came. It arrived not in the new mailbox, but delivered by hand. A sour-faced man in a pressed government uniform pulled up in a county car, the tires crunching on the gravel. He handed Maria the folded, creased envelope, his eyes scanning the half-repaired farmhouse with open disapproval. It was from the state, the Department of Child and Family Services. The words felt like a physical slap. A formal review of your case has been reopened due to new testimony concerning the well-being of your children. She felt the blood drain from her face. Her hand started to shake as she read the second page. An anonymous community member has raised concerns regarding the children's current living conditions and the presence of an unrelated male in the home. She didn't need to see a name. She knew. Miss Tillman. The old woman's poison had found a new way to seep into her life. She was never going to let go of the idea that Maria was an unfit mother. Maria didn't sleep a wink that night. Neither did Samuel. He found her sitting on the steps of the barn, staring out into the darkness, the official letter crumpled in her fist. The wind howled through the broken slats of the barn roof, a lonely, mournful sound. "She's trying to tear it all down," Maria whispered, her voice thick with despair. "Everything we've built." "She won't succeed," Samuel said, his voice a low rumble beside her. "She might, Samuel. I don't have a lease for this place. I don't have a full-time job. We barely have running water. What judge in their right mind is going to ignore all of that?" He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the dark, bruised circles under her eyes. He saw the way she was hugging her own arms, as if she was afraid she might physically fall apart if she let go. "There's something I need to tell you," he said finally, his voice heavy. "Something I've been holding back." Maria tensed, turning to face him. "What is it?" "My wife," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "Evelyn. She wasn't just sick when she died." He took a shaky breath. She was pregnant. Maria's eyes widened. She didn't speak. "She died before I could get her to the hospital," he continued, the words coming out in a pained rush. I didn't move fast enough. She was in pain, but I didn't believe it was that bad. I thought she was being dramatic. By the time I realized how serious it was too late. He swallowed hard, the sound loud in the quiet night. Her parents, they blamed me. They told everyone I let her die, that I killed her and my own child through my negligence. And after a while, I started to believe them. That's why I just stopped living. Maria was silent, not because she was judging him, but because she knew that kind of weight. She knew what it felt like to carry a burden so heavy it felt like it was bending your spine to the ground. I'm telling you this now, he said, his voice low and intense, because if we're going to fight this, they are going to look into everything. My past, my record, my grief. They're going to look at us. She nodded slowly, processing his confession. Then she looked him straight in the eye and said something that stunned him. Good. He blinked. Good? You think I want to fight for my children standing next to a man who's never been broken? She asked, a flicker of her old fire returning to her eyes. I need someone who knows what it's like to be at the bottom. I need someone who knows how to fight their way back up. Samuel let out a breath he didn't even realize he'd been holding. It came out as a short, dry laugh, a sound that was bitter and relieved all at once. I'll stand with you, Maria, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Not in front of me, she corrected him, her voice soft but firm. He met her gaze in the darkness, and he understood. Beside you, he promised. Always. They didn't have a lawyer they couldn't afford, so they fought back with the only thing they had, the truth. They got to work. Samuel went to the county courthouse and legally registered the property in both of their names. He filed for 12 different land rehabilitation grants. Maria got a formal, on-the-books job, mucking out stalls at a neighboring ranch down the road. It was hard work, but it was official income. They bought a used water tank and rigged up a system to get running water to the house. They built a makeshift pantry and filled it with non-perishable food. And they went to the local school and officially registered all 5 children for the upcoming fall semester. They documented every single thing they did. They took pictures. They saved receipts. They weren't trying to pretend their life was perfect. They were just trying to show that they were trying openly, honestly, visibly. And they hoped that would be enough. When the social worker finally came, a stern-looking woman with a clipboard and skeptical eyes, the kids were the ones who spoke for them. I get to eat every single day now, the youngest boy announced proudly. Mama doesn't cry as much anymore, one of the twins added quietly. And then Mia, standing tall and straight, looked the social worker right in the eye. And we like Samuel, she said, her voice clear and strong. He doesn't try to be our dad. He's just here. Maria stood in the doorway of the farmhouse, her fingers clenched so tightly behind her back that her knuckles were white. She watched the social worker scribbling notes on her clipboard, nodding, asking questions. At the end of the hour-long inspection, the woman closed her notepad, a strange expression on her face. She looked at Maria and offered a small, tired smile. "You're not what I was expecting," she said. Maria raised an eyebrow. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" The woman shrugged, her smile widening just a fraction. "For today," she said, "it's a very good thing." That night, after the kids were asleep, they sat by the fire pit. The baby was asleep in Samuel's lap, his little chest rising and falling rhythmically. Maria stood behind Samuel's chair, her hair loose around her shoulders, her expression soft in the firelight. "Do you still think about her?" she asked softly. He didn't have to ask who she meant. He didn't pretend not to understand. "Every day," he answered honestly. She nodded. "That won't change, not even if you stay here." "I don't want it to," he said quietly. She walked around the fire and sat on the log beside him. Her hand brushed against his, a light, fleeting touch. "I still see him too," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "The kid's father, before he disappeared. He used to call me his sunshine." Samuel looked at her, his heart aching for her. "Do you hate him?" She was quiet for a long, long time, just staring into the dancing flames. "No," she said finally. "I don't think I hate him. I think I just stopped needing him to come back." He nodded, understanding completely. The flames crackled and hissed, filling the silence between them. It was a long silence, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with everything they had survived, everything they had built. Then Samuel turned to face her. He hesitated for just a second, and then he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of passion or possession. It wasn't a kiss of salvation. It was just a kiss, a quiet, purposeful kiss from one person choosing another. Maria didn't cry, but when she kissed him back, she felt her fingers tremble. And across town, in the dim yellow light of her perfectly neat parlor, Miss Tillman sat alone, watching her cup of tea grow cold. Her anonymous report had failed. The town had moved on to new gossip. Her mouth twisted into a bitter, resentful line as she heard a faint sound drift through her open window. It was the sound of laughter. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. It was coming from the edge of town, from the place where the unwanted, the broken, the outcasts, had built something that no rumor could ever burn down. The annual town fair arrived earlier than usual that spring, a riot of bright canvas tents, tinny carnival music, and the sweet smell of popcorn hanging in the air. And judgment. The judgment was there, too, tucked away in certain glances, in the tight, disapproving smiles of the town's gatekeepers. Maria hadn't planned on going, not because she was afraid of them anymore, but because some wounds are private. They don't need to be put on public display. But the children had begged. Mia had been practicing a song with the little school choir that had formed, and she was scheduled to perform. The twins had been promised a ride on the Ferris wheel, and the baby, who was no longer a baby but a smiling, gurgling toddler, now lit up at the sound of music. So she went. Samuel drove them in the old pickup truck. When they arrived and started walking through the fairgrounds, the eyes found them immediately. Some were wide with surprise, others were narrow and cold. Most were filled with that same quiet disapproval that had followed Maria like a second shadow for years. She held her head high. Samuel walked steadily beside her. He didn't hold her hand in public. Not yet. They hadn't put a label on the strange, beautiful, fragile thing that was growing between them. It was still too new, too precious. But he was there, a quiet, solid presence at her side. Until, suddenly, he wasn't. She had turned to buy the kids some cotton candy, and when she turned back, he was gone. At first, she didn't think anything of it. He had probably just followed one of the kids who had wandered off or run into someone he knew. But then she saw it. A crowd was gathering near the small wooden stage at the center of the fairgrounds. And then she heard his voice. It rose above the murmur of the crowd, not shouting, but clear and strong and utterly unshakable. "My name is Samuel Lowe," he said, standing on the small stage that was usually reserved for pie-eating contests and announcements about lost children. "I've lived in this town for most of my life. I've lost almost everything in it, too." His eyes scanned the crowd of familiar faces, faces that had known him forever, faces that had judged him and whispered about him, and one face, near the back, that was frozen in a mask of pure venom, Miss Tillman. "But something happened to me this year," Samuel continued, his voice ringing with conviction. "Someone showed me what it looks like to lose everything, and still choose to love. Not loudly, not for show, just fiercely, quietly, stubbornly." He glanced across the crowd, and his eyes found Maria's. "And I am done," he said. his voice dropping but gaining intensity. I am done pretending that I haven't found something worth standing beside, something worth building for, something worth fighting with. A gasp went through the crowd. Someone coughed nervously. A woman whispered to her friend, "Is he talking about her?" A small, certain smile touched Samuel's lips. "She is not what you say she is," he declared, his voice booming now. "She is not a rumor. She is not a case file. She is not a scar. She is the reason I remembered what it feels like to be alive, and I will not spend one more day of my life letting this town or anyone in it try to shame something that should be celebrated." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "So, if you're wondering whether I've chosen her, you're asking the wrong question. The real question is whether I'm good enough for her. And I plan on spending the rest of my life trying to be." Maria didn't cry. Not yet. She just turned, her heart pounding in her chest, and walked away. She walked past the booth selling honey sticks. She walked past the whispering mouths and the staring eyes. She walked past the popcorn and the prizes and the swirling confetti. Samuel found her a few moments later, waiting by the back gate of the fairgrounds. He was out of breath, his face flushed, a look of hopeful terror in his eyes. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice quiet. "Yes," he said, breathing heavily. "I did. I wanted to. Now they'll never stop talking. Let them," he said. She looked up at him then, and he saw something fragile and fierce flickering in her dark eyes. "Did you mean it?" she asked. "All of it?" He didn't have to ask what she meant. He just nodded, his throat too tight to speak. And then she did something that neither of them expected. She reached into the pocket of her jeans, pulled out a tiny folded-up piece of paper, and handed it to him. He carefully unfolded it. Inside, written in her neat, careful handwriting, was a name, a phone number, and an address in a town he'd never heard of, hundreds of miles away. "What is this?" he asked, confused. Maria looked up at him, her gaze clear and steady. "If we're really going to build a life together, Samuel, it should be ours, not a compromise, not an act of defiance against this town, not something that we have to fight to keep alive in the cracks." His heart sank a little. "You want to leave?" "No," she said, and she reached out and took his hand. "I want to choose. For the first time in my life, I don't want to react. I don't want to just survive. I want to choose." She placed his hand over her own heart. "I'm choosing me. I'm choosing my kids. And I'm inviting you to come with us." Samuel stared at her for a long moment, 1,000 emotions swirling inside him, and then a slow, wide, unguarded smile spread across his face. "Maria Rivera," he said, his voice thick with wonder, "I would follow you anywhere." They didn't pack much, just what they could fit into the back of the old pickup truck. The rest of their meager belongings, the patched-up furniture, the extra blankets, the tools, they gave away to another family on the outskirts of town who they knew was struggling. They were leaving the ghosts behind, folded into the corners of the old farmhouse, buried beneath the floorboards. On their last night in Grace Lake, they didn't sleep in the house. They camped out in the half-repaired barn, which they had decorated with strings of fairy lights and old wool blankets. The kids sang songs they'd made up. Samuel played an old beat-up guitar he'd found, and Maria just watched them all, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the lights, looking like someone who was finally waking up from a long and difficult dream. The baby, who they had started calling Eli, gurgled happily. Mia looked up from where she was drawing in her notebook and said, "We should give him a middle name." Maria raised an eyebrow. "He has a middle name." "No, I mean a new one," Mia insisted. She looked over at Samuel, who had gone quiet, the guitar resting in his lap. A slow understanding dawned on Maria's face. She looked at Samuel, her expression soft, and then she looked at her youngest son. "Samuel," she said softly, His middle name will be Samuel. Samuel's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't let them fall. He just leaned over, his shoulders shaking slightly, and kissed the baby's forehead. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice choked with an emotion too big for words. They left at sunrise the next morning. There was no parade, no tearful farewells, just 5 children, laughing and bouncing in the back of an old truck, a woman with the windows rolled down and the wind in her hair, and a man who was holding her hand so tightly as if he never wanted to let go. The town of Grace Lake faded away in the rearview mirror. As they reached the last turn in the road that would take them away from that place forever, Samuel pulled the truck over to the side. A light snow had started to fall again, a late, freak spring storm, the flakes glittering in the early morning light. He got out of the truck and held out his hand, palm up, into the falling snow. Maria got out and stood beside him. She placed her hand in his, and together, standing in the quiet hush of the falling snow, they held on. Not because they needed saving anymore, but because they had finally, freely, and completely chosen each other. If you made it this far into the story, you're one of the real ones. And I have to ask you, what part of this story hit you the hardest? Was it the moment Samuel shared his groceries? Was it when Maria stood up to the social worker? Let me know in the comments below, because your stories and your thoughts are what keep this channel going. And if you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button. You won't regret it.